Great. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us at this Little Village seminar. It's to mark the launch of a new Little Village report that has been supported by the JRF, and it's all about levels of poverty in the under fives. I think it's a really important report. It's got some very worrying findings. It's also got some suggestions for what we might want to do about under five levels of poverty as part of it. So it's really great to see so many of you join us this afternoon. I think this is a really key moment to be talking about what we can do about child poverty. My name's Sonia Soda. I'm chief leader writer at The Observer, which means I write our editorial column, and child poverty is a subject that we write about a lot. I think we've got sort of a number of really worrying kind of circumstances around the cost for living. So we've got energy bills going up. We've got very, very high childcare costs. Food prices are going up, all things that make it really, really difficult for parents on low incomes to sort of balance already precarious budgets. But I think it's important not to forget as well that policy choices have made things far, far more difficult for families with children over the last decade. And, you know, it's something that we write about a lot in our editorial column. The fact that over the last decade, we've seen a series of cuts made to the benefit system and to the tax credit system that have really penalised families with children, particularly young children. And we've seen some families lose thousands of pounds from their budgets a year as a result of the cumulative cuts that we've seen to tax credits and benefits since 2010. And that's something that has it has not been addressed in the last couple of years. We've seen the sort of the uplift to universal credit, which should be seen in the context of a decade of cuts, taken away from families at the end of last year. And we also saw that the financial support that the Chancellor has provided to help with rising energy bills, that's been spread very thinly across a very large group of families rather than being targeted at families who are struggling the most. So I think we've got some very challenging economic circumstances that we're facing at the moment as a country, but that comes in the wake of a decade of policy choices that have made life much harder for families on a low income. So I think this report comes at a very, very important time for all of us. The format of today is we're first of all going to hear from Sophia Moreau, who's from Little Village, and from Carla Kebela from the JRF. They are going to give us a short presentation about the findings of the report and some of the recommendations. And then we have a panel of three excellent respondents to give us their thoughts. And I'll introduce them in turn once we've heard about the report. We're also going to make sure that we leave some time for questions. And I would ask if you've got questions for any of the panelists, I'd ask you to sort of put them in the Q&A box and we can come to them at the end. And we're going to make sure we sort of wrap up by 1:15. So first of all, I am going to hand over to Sophia, who is going to introduce the report and some of its findings. So over to you, Sophia.
Thanks so much. Today we're presenting our research report, It Takes a Village, which is kindly supported by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation for a second year. This is comprised of analysis by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, in addition to qualitative focus groups we've done with families on low income with a child under 5 and families that have used our baby bank services. We've also done a national survey with nearly 1,400 families with a child under 5 on low income. I'm going to be handing over to my colleague Carla from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation and then coming back to cover some of the stories behind these figures with family experiences. Thank you.
Thanks, Sophia. I'm going to share my slides. I hope you can all see that okay. And thanks again for coming today. So I'm going to speak to you a bit about the poverty rates and drivers of poverty for children and families with under 5. So the first thing I thought I'd do is explain why we are focusing on children in a family with under 5 and not just poverty rates for children who are themselves under the age of 5. So the poverty rates for children under the age of 5 are higher than poverty rates for older children. However, the poverty that they experience also impacts the lives of their older siblings in their family. So we think it's important to measure the child poverty rate for all children in these families and not just the children under the age of 5. So you can see from this chart that the poverty rate for children in a family with an under 5 is consistently higher than for children where the youngest child is older than that. And we also know that half of children in poverty live in a family with someone who's under the age of 5. So if we're to do anything to end child poverty, we must understand the drivers of poverty and support out of poverty for these families. So I hope that sort of clarifies a bit why we're focusing on that group. And I should also say that I might interchangeably call this group children in a family with a young child. So actually looking at this chart, focusing on the trend over the last 25 years, we can see that the poverty rate for children in a family with an under 5 was decreasing until the early 2000s, and then has fluctuated a bit, and then again has been increasing since around 2011. There's consistently a gap between this top line, the blue line, and children children in families where the youngest child is older. This means in the latest year, more than 1 in 3 children in a family with a young child were living in poverty. So we also know that poverty rates for children in a family with an under 5 varies across the country. So the highest poverty rates are seen in the Northeast and in London, and the lowest in Northern Ireland and in Scotland. So obviously these rates are really concerning in themselves, but this actually means that around 400,000 children with a young child in their family are trapped in poverty in London alone. So we also know that certain groups where there is a child under the age of 5 are at even greater risk of poverty. So when there is a baby in the family, poverty rates are even higher than when there's just a child under the age of 5. And it's really worrying that so many babies in the UK are, begin their lives in poverty. More than half of children in single parent families with an under 5 are trapped in poverty, and around half with a young parent and also from a minority ethnic background. Having one or more person in the family with a disability also increases a child's risk of living in poverty, particularly when the person with a disability is a parent. So through the rest of the presentation, I'm going to have a look at the differences in the drivers of poverty for these groups, as well as comparing them to the overall rates for children in a family with a young child. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about housing. So we know that children living in the rented sector are at a greater risk of poverty than those living in a property that their parents own. So children in families with an under 5 are much less likely to live in a house that their parent owns than all people in the UK. So homeowners are the first 2 purple parts in the bar chart. So instead, you can see that they're more likely to live in the social or private rented sector. So that's the second half of the bar. Focusing on children who are in single or young parent families with a child under 5, a significantly lower proportion live in a house that their parent owns, even compared to other groups. So the other groups that we're looking at, you can see that the purple section is really, really small. Although I've not shown it in this chart, if we were to look at children in either of these family types who are also living in poverty, only 5% live in a property that their parent owns. This is either with a mortgage or outright. So that means a very large proportion are living in rented accommodation. So for children in both of these family types, and also for children from a minority ethnic background, there's a higher proportion living in the more expensive private rented sector than is found for families in general with a child under the age of 5. Now, the private rented sector can be both unaffordable, particularly in locations like London, but it's also more unstable for families. So the purple bars here show the proportion of children trapped in poverty in each of the groups that I've been talking about. The light purple part of the bar shows the proportion of children that are pulled into poverty due to their housing costs, while the dark purple part represents the proportion of children who were living in poverty even before they paid for their housing. So here we can see that housing costs are pushing a higher proportion of children in single and young parent families, and also children from a minority ethnic background where there's a child under the age of 5 into poverty. So the pale purple parts of the bar are quite a lot larger. For these 3 groups, around 3 in 20 children are being pushed into poverty due to their housing costs. We also know that these same groups are more likely to be living in unaffordable housing and spending higher proportions of their income on their housing costs. So it really highlights the importance of affordable housing and alleviating the risk of poverty for families with a young child. And I also want to think about this chart on the flip side. There's also a really high proportion of children in a family with an under 5 in each of these groups that are trapped in poverty even before they pay for housing. The dark purple bars show that there's far too many children in this situation. So in addition to the 3 groups mentioned earlier, children in a family with an under 5 where there's a disabled parent have a particularly high proportion that are in poverty both before and after housing costs. So that means for these families, incomes are already really too low even before they pay for their housing. And this is something I'm going to come back to in a minute. So households where there's a child are more likely than households without children to be living in overcrowded accommodation. But for some families, overcrowding is much more of a problem. So 1 in 5 minority ethnic households with a child under 5 are in overcrowded housing, and 3 in 20 households that are headed by a single parent or where there's a disabled child are in overcrowded housing. Now, considering the slide that I've just shown you before this, it's really, really stark and striking that for single parent minority ethnic households, this is the case, when we know that housing costs are driving so much of the poverty that they experience. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about work. So from the earlier slide, we know that lots of families' incomes are already too low even before they pay for housing. Now, work has always been seen as a way out of poverty. And while it's clear from lots of research that it does reduce the risk of poverty, the proportion of children trapped in poverty where at least one parent is work has been increasing year on year. And we see a very similar trend for children in a family with an under 5. This means that just now, there's more than 2/3 of children in a family with an under 5 who are living in poverty where there's at least one parent in work. So this really brings into question the effectiveness of work in its current quality, particularly in low-paid and insecure sectors, in lifting people out of poverty. So I'm going to have a little think before finishing about the differences for different groups. So for families with a child under 5, there are clear reasons why work may not be the best option for lifting a family out of poverty, particularly when the child is a baby or toddler. And this slide aims to sort of highlight that different types of families need different support. In this chart, the light purple bar shows the proportion of children in families that are in work in each of these groups, while the dark purple bar shows exactly the same thing, but only for children in poverty. For each of these groups we've focused on, you can see there's a gap between the pale and dark purple bars, with the proportion of children where there's a parent in work being lower for children in poverty. So, work definitely has a role in lifting people out of poverty. However, you can also see that there's a huge amount of variation across these groups, even for children within a single parent family in general, so not in poverty, just all single parent families. We see that 2 in 5 have a parent in work. So this is much lower than the other groups. This suggests that these families need better support into work, including affordable and suitable childcare and adequate social security when a single parent can't work to lift incomes and help them get out of poverty. However, as I showed you in the previous slide, it's not a simple case of just getting people jobs, since such a high proportion of children who are living in poverty do have someone in work. So you can see that for nearly half of children in from a minority ethnic background who live with a under 5 are living in poverty, yet 3/4 of them have a parent in work. So other work conducted by GRF found that minority ethnic workers were overrepresented in low-paid sectors and insecure sectors are more likely than white workers to be underemployed. So that means that they would like more work and can do more work. So this points to work being inadequate and need for better paying hours, as well as supporting both parents to work or receive sufficient social security if they can. For many families with a young child, work could support them to increase their incomes and lift them out of poverty. But inadequate pay, job insecurity, and underemployment means that many families are trapped in poverty, even when someone is working. For others, as I've said, work might not be a suitable option, particularly when they have very young children, have caring responsibilities, or are disabled. So it's really of the utmost importance that we have an adequate social security system when it is needed. So I hope I've highlighted the urgency and needed to tackle child poverty for families with a child under 5. And we need policies in place now that support families across a range of areas, including housing, work, and social security, to give a better start in the early years. I'm going to hand back to Sophia, who is going to tell you about the research that Little Village undertook earlier this year and delve into these issues in more detail, as well as showing the experiences of people who are living in poverty. I'll stop sharing there.
Thank you kindly, Carla. Now that Carla from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation has contextualised the stark realities that are facing families across the country with those harrowing figures, we're going to be looking at the stories behind these figures and the families that are impacted and currently living in poverty and facing extreme difficulty escaping poverty. To understand our approach, it's helpful to know a bit about the history of Little Village. We started off as a movement of parents challenging child poverty by sharing high quality pre-cut, pre-loved kits with each other. That includes cots, blankets, toys, formula, bottles to feed children, a safe place to sleep. Having a child is like a startup investment. It's extremely costly, and those are essential expenses and ways of providing for children that you cannot cut back on. So it is still very close to that ground, although we are now no longer solely comprised of volunteers. For our part, in following the ethos of it taking a village to raise a child, we have a network of baby banks in London where we equip families with that pre-loved high quality kit. We link them with essential key services through a signposting and guidance program. And we also work alongside parents and caregivers to fix the system that is keeping them trapped in poverty and centering family voice. So we've seen the national figures on housing that the Joseph Rowntree has kindly provided in their analysis. In our survey and in the focus groups that we've done with families, we found that the majority said that they do not feel that they live somewhere that has enough space for their family. When you have young children, you're more likely to be tipped into overcrowding, which is both a primary indicator and a driver of poverty. 43% said that housing conditions had a negative impact on their child's development or health. 52% said that housing conditions had a negative impact on their health, mental or physical. That is huge well-being impacts and health impacts, and even at times a disabling impact on the well-being of entire families, particularly with young children. Here is in the words of the families that we have done focus groups and interviews with. They speak of the guilt and the shame and the stigma surrounding living in unsuitable living conditions and overcrowding when you have a very young child, of the difficulties explaining this to their children, of even developing back problems and struggling with the safety of their children in unsuitable temporary and emergency accommodation, of sharing a single bed with your young child who is at times perhaps may not even be your only child, of whole families sharing a room together. As you've seen in the data provided by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, children who are under the age of 5 and living in poverty will often be in larger families as well. As a baby bank, we know very well the difficulties of juggling essential costs. And as we've seen with the rising inflation and the cost of energy bills, families will be choosing between necessities. Every single day we hear stories of families cutting back when they cannot cut anymore. As you can see here, they say, I've cut everything where possible and we still have nothing left. Talk of the cut to universal credit and as well as the rise in energy bills. Families are between a rock and a hard place. As you can see here, one mum even spoke of needing to cut the toes of her child's onesie so that she can use them for a little longer because she cannot keep up with the pace of the growth of a young child. These are struggles that are unique to families with very young children due to the pace of their growth, the need to provide essential kits for them, and the difficulties with meeting essential costs when you have such a high cost of living, particularly with families in London. This is something that we see quite often with our baby banks as well. So these figures are specifically from our impacts data at Little Village. 49% of families told us that they wouldn't have been able to afford the core items for their children unless they were provided by Little Village. Those are costs such as a cot, a safe way of feeding their baby, a way of transporting their children. 38% that they would have had to cut back in other areas if they were to provide for them. We'll often hear parents speaking of skipping meals in order to provide for their children. Parents will inevitably always say that they are prioritizing their children's needs over their own, but in order to be functioning in the way that every child has the best start to life and every family is holistically supported, they should not be making these impossible choices, and that is why we exist, reluctantly. Unaffordable childcare is a prevailing theme amongst families with preschool-age children. A shocking 67% of the families that we surveyed, nearly 1,400 families, said that the cost of childcare stops parents from being able to work or do the job that they want to do. 23% said that they had lost a job due to the lack of suitable childcare, which heavily intersects with the motherhood penalty at work. 27% said that they had to leave a training or educational course due to lack of suitable childcare. So the lack of affordable, accessible and suitable high quality childcare is preventing families from even retraining and having avenues to exit poverty in the long term. Many of the stories that families have shared with us surround the impossibility of affording childcare even when you are in work. It is preventing them from entering the workforce and from work paying when you are in work. And when you consider the extreme difficulty that parents in poverty are experiencing, managing stress, the complex administration of balancing a budget when you have no money, it's a mathematical exercise on a day-to-day basis. And then when you consider that they are working and the money is not going far due to childcare hours, they will often find themselves in a position where they are either forced out of the workforce or every penny is going towards childcare, and it's a choice between childcare and bills. Families are also, unsurprisingly, speaking of stifled progress, of extreme challenges in maintaining a place on an educational training course when they are on particularly universal credit, of needing to pay for childcare months in advance, of not accessing enough subsidy, and of the extreme challenge of affording bills when you're in this position. That is why parents who are with young children on education courses are more likely to have to drop out as a result of this. And generally the feeling that is conveyed in these interviews and focus groups was feeling penalized for trying to exit their circumstances and escape poverty and progress in life. It is disincentivizing and stifling progress. We are not supporting families with the tools to exit poverty and enter the workforce and retrain. Unsurprisingly, the families that we have worked with and interviewed and spoken with through focus groups have spoken of the role of stigma and stereotyping in both damaging their well-being, leading to feelings of guilt and shame, and impacting their ability to reach out for help and how their requests for help are received. This is particularly true for families from marginalized backgrounds, such as families who are racial minorities, such as young parent families, single parent families. As you can see, one parent says that she feels that she is viewed as a statistic. Another said that the stigma needs to stop because it prevents people from reaching out for help. Many speak of the role that this has had in reducing their mental health, and perinatal health is a crisis state in this country, particularly following the pandemic. What we have seen in these focus groups and in the national survey, as well as the Joseph Rowntree Foundation's analysis that was provided to us as part of this report, is consistent with what we have seen in providing our baby bank services. Families are reporting that prior to receiving support from us, they did not have for their children a safe place for their children to sleep. 48% said that they didn't have a clean space for their children to play in. And play has such a key role in learning for young children. Or even a warm coat and shoes for outdoor use. 56% said that their children did not have that. So while air and outdoor spaces may be free, who knows if you even have access to a park or maintained green spaces or playgrounds or children's centres, let alone the kids to get your child outside. And unsurprisingly, this is having a huge role in parental stress levels, well-being. And that is inevitably, we are human beings. We are entire people that we bring to our roles as parents, as employees. Parents are saying that they were anxious about how they were going to support their child, that they were in a bad place with their mental health. 56%, the majority said that they experienced this. And even saying nearly 50% said that they either feel that they were a bad mum as a result of difficulties providing for their children financially. And it is often, unfortunately, mothers. It is heavily gendered. And nearly 50% were worried that social services or another agency would feel that they weren't looking after their children well. So, and we could go on this all day, but if we boil it down to 3 key recommendations that we feel would heavily lift as many children as possible out of poverty, is investing in affordable quality childcare for all children, starting with children from low income backgrounds. Currently, research from the Sutton Trust Foundation, the Sutton Trust has found that most of the childcare subsidy for 33 hours is actually going to children from middle and high income households. It's not reaching the children from the lowest income households. Reinvesting in local authority early years support services to help close the gap by the time children start school. Things like children's centres, perinatal mental health services, particularly for families from marginalised backgrounds. Things like early years, special educational needs and disability services. The early years are heavily neglected within that. And of course, making universal credit and the benefit system work for families, removing the punitive two-child limit, which keeps a majority of families with young children who are in poverty because they are generally larger families with more than 3 children. And essentially, moving from a place of stigma, parental blame, and working in silos to solidarity and support. We are doing our best to provide that village and foster that support and solidarity for families, but we cannot do that alone. our baby banks cannot reach all families. So we need pragmatic policy changes to lift as many families with young children as possible out of poverty. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you so much to Sophia and to Carla for those really kind of illuminating presentations. I think everyone will agree there are some really worrying findings. And I think it's a really good reminder, first of all, that it's not just about incomings and income. It's also very much child poverty is about, you know, what families are having to spend on. And I thought that the data around housing costs and the cost of childcare were really, really striking. And I think Sophia's presentation about the Little Village research really reminds us as well. I think sometimes when we talk about, when politicians talk about poverty, it's too often about kind of grand statistics and numbers. And obviously this is families' lived reality. And I think the qualitative research that Little Village has done really injects some of that back into the debate. So thank you both of you for that. I'm now going to come to our panel of respondents. So first of all, I'm going to ask Emily De Bruyn, who is the chair of Hartlepool Baby Bank. You're also a mother of two, I understand. So you've been there, done that. You've got lived experience of growing up in what you describe as the wrong postcode. So I'm really interested to hear what you make of what we've just heard. So over to you initially, Emily.
Thanks, Sonia. Yes, so I'm Emily from Hartlepool Baby Bank. And those who may not even know where Hartlepool is, we're up on the northeast coast, think between Middlesbrough and Newcastle. Yeah, I grew up in what I class as the wrong postcode. My geography tutor famously asked us to plot our postcodes and said, if you lived in certain postcodes, you would not get anywhere in life, you would not achieve. I nearly died of shock when I popped up and put a pin right in the middle of the area that he had said, we might as well fail and give up. So how did Hartlepool Baby Bank come around? In 2019, myself and two friends started the Baby Bank because we wanted to make a difference to local families that we could see were already feeling the pinch. So we got a free community centre and we set out, and in our first week we had 6 families. Yesterday in the session I ran, we had 31 families alone. That's a 4-hour period coming through the doors. As Sophia said, there is a lot of stigma in using a baby bank. We have no signage because our families told us, if you put up a sign, we won't come because we're ashamed. And that breaks my heart because you shouldn't have to be ashamed to ask for or receive any help. Like Little Village, we fear that this is going to be our busiest year on record. Last year, we supported over 350 brand new families, as well as supporting a few hundred families who we had already got to know and had come on this ride with us. I don't think any of us are surprised that the situation is worsening. We all know it's tough out there on the streets for the families that we are supporting. And yet Carla's figures managed to horrify me and sadden me all at once. And I just want to thank Little Village for giving us the chance to speak about what it's like up here in the northeast. Because we know here that 47% of children in families with an under 5 are facing poverty. And we know that those percentages are just worsening because costs are rising. But when I thought about it, it shocked me a little bit because it's easy to focus on the rise in gas and electricity, to get lost in the fear of filling up your car to get to work because you need that money to get anywhere in the first place. But for me, and I knew that food costs were rising, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. So I went back because I never delete an email and I had all my click and collect receipts from during the pandemic and the lockdowns. And I had a look at it and I price checked exactly the same bread and milk that I bought in April 21. Now that bread, that loaf was 79 pence. That exact same loaf is now £1.15. 4 pints of milk then was £1.09. It's now £1.25. That was 52 pence extra for the same 2 products. And I don't know any family who would use just 4 pints of milk and 1 loaf of bread in reality, so I doubled it. Now, as we said, I'm a mum of 2, so I do get child benefit, and I benefited from that small raise recently, 65 pence for my first child, 45 pence for my second. But I only had £1.10 and I've spent it all on bread and milk before I've got anywhere. And it's tiny little rises like that, that when I first heard of it, I thought, oh, it's a tiny rise, but it's something. But it's gone. I've spent it on bread and milk. So then I thought, well, is it any wonder that the numbers coming through my door are rising? And I thought it might be interesting to look at a few examples of what life's like for my baby bank users. And I also wanted to say that Carla made a fantastic point on overcrowding, because up here in the north, the rent is cheaper, the mortgages are cheaper, and yet I have families who are willingly asking to be overcrowded to give them a bit more money back in their pocket. And I used to be a social housing officer, and I have to explain to them that the housing agencies are not going to make you overcrowded, even if you think you can sleep in the living room forever, because yes, it'll give you a bit more money in your pocket, but that's not quality of life, and it's really hard. Just yesterday's example, a social worker came to see me because they are working with a newly arrived family, and this family has been using their freezer for 1 hour a day because the cost on the meter is terrifying them. And I had to sit down and explain to them, you can't keep your fridge and your freezer on for just 1 hour a day, you're gonna get sick. And they basically said to me, are there other choices? And it broke my heart. We've had a rise in requests for dressing gowns. Now up north, I give it, we're famous for doing the school run in our pajamas. So at first, I didn't understand the significance. And then I saw children using dressing gowns instead of coats. I saw children coming in to the baby bank in their dressing gowns. And I asked the family, what's this all about? And they said, well, a dressing gown, we already had it. Or a dressing gown means when we're wearing it at home, we can turn the heating down. We can leave it off for longer because we've layered up. And I get children shuffling through my doors. And I say shuffling because they're in hand-me-down shoes that are so clearly not the right size. And I have to persuade that little one to sit down and let me try on some shoes with him so we can hopefully kit him out in some shoes that are the right size. Because how do you move around freely as a toddler if you're shimmying around in what was somebody else's shoes? And the shoes that I give them might not be new, but they will be the right size. And I think that's a huge improvement just to begin with. And just to sort of sum up a little bit in why we agreed to do this, it's because the importance of this data is just huge. The campaigning, the policy, the looking for change. I run a baby bank because I have to. I don't want to. In 2022, it breaks my heart that we even need baby banks across the UK, that we're looking at how to work together. We shouldn't even have to. We're in a rich, developing country. And I think it's only by working together, by raising the importance of these figures, is that we can hopefully persuade the government to listen, because we all know the importance of starting and getting it right from the beginning. The research shows us that £1 invested in early years is worth, is it £13 later on, just to fix the mistakes that we don't need to be making. And I had more to say, and I'll be honest, I got passionate, and I just really want to thank everybody for coming together to work together on this, because these are real families and we are making a huge difference. And it's just so saddening for me that we have to. But it's also for my volunteers, who are quite often BME families or marginalised. Talks like this, I spoke to my volunteers yesterday and they said it gave them hope. It gave them a sense that somebody is listening and that we're really making a difference. So we just need to make that difference. And I'll stop now. So thanks very much, Sonia.
Thanks, Emily. That was great. And I completely agree with you. It just feels so immoral that in one of the richest countries in the world, we have families who can't afford to keep their fridge switched on, and children who can't wear the right size shoes, which we know has an impact on their physical health long into adulthood. And that is kind of one of the things I think that's we always have to remember as well. Growing up in poverty, it's not a fleeting thing. It's not something you can wave a magic wand and make go away 5 years later. Growing up in child poverty has a lasting impact on children well into adulthood, and it reduces people's life chances, for decades to come. So it's really a long-term evil that we're creating for ourselves as a society, as well as the horrible choices that some parents find themselves having to make. So thank you so much for that. I'm now going to come to Annika Russell, who is an early years consultant. She's the founder of Enjoy EY, which is an early years consultancy service. And you've got 2 decades of working as a teacher, an inspector, and a local authority advisor to schools, nurseries, and policymakers. So I'm really interested in hearing from you about what impact this is having on the services that families with young children use. So over to you. Oh, Annika, you're on mute.
Sorry, thank you so much. And yes, thank you for that introduction, and just listening to everything Emily is saying, it just yeah, it is hard to listen to. It's hard to know that in 2022 this is still happening. And actually, before I touch on some of the work that I'm doing now and my area of expertise and the work that I do, I think it's important for context, just to, similar to Emily, I'm a mother of 2, and I mean, in terms of my lived experience, I started off in social housing. I grew up in an estate in Peckham, lived through overcrowding, my parents in a single room, and then I've got 3 siblings, all 4 of us in 1 bedroom. The report talks about, and I just want to echo for the report about poverty not being permanent. Thankfully, it wasn't for me. Myself and all of my siblings, we're all graduates, where we've got good careers now. It doesn't need to be permanent, but that goes back to that high quality childcare. That was our savior for us. We were very lucky to attend really high quality community childcare in those formative years. And it's an essential public service, something that really needs to be top of the government's agenda for under 5s, accessible, affordable, and high quality. And that's where, in the work that I do, that I'm really passionate about, is making sure that there's that high quality childcare. So yeah, as Sonia said, I work as an early years consultant. And every day when I am working with these nurseries, I look and I'm just, you hear the struggles, you hear the things that are going on every day in these nurseries. And I just sit there and I think, in one of the richest countries, nothing short of an overhaul of our childcare system is needed. I think there's way too much statistics for too many years that have been available to, in research to kind of speak to that. And I think the models are there. We can look over the border at Denmark, Finland. They're getting it right. They're subsidizing childcare, and things are working for them, for their low income families. I was happy to hear that there's going to be a discussion on the APPG, which I'm going to be attending on the 18th of May, where they're talking about this as well, which is fantastic. So it's good. I'm really happy to see this report, and that things are moving forward. But and I think here in the UK, we do have everything that we need to build that world-class childcare system. I think one of the key things that's important though is valuing that workforce, valuing the workforce that are going to run that childcare system. I think at the moment we are seeing huge issues around recruitment and retention of staff, and that is due to the fact that I think we are able to, if properly funded, that we are able to attract, retain, and reward our staff properly to ensure that that high quality is happening, because they are a key part of that high quality childcare that we're talking about today. And one of the things, going back to the report, is the parent voice just really struck a chord with me. Just capturing parents talking about those support services being an easy reach. And I think one of one of the parents in the focus group spoke about her pram being broken and not actually physically being able to attend those support services because of things, you know, those essentials that they didn't have access to. And again, parents being in a rut in terms of the high childcare costs, going to work and working, but then all that money going back into childcare again, it's counterproductive. How is anyone going to, how are we ever going to break that cycle of poverty if this is what's happening? And even for myself, I'm very lucky to have a fairly well-paid career. I've struggled with childcare myself, let alone, you know, so it's really sad. And I think, you know, just as I was reading through the report, I was really looking at, you know, in trying to look at it from a really solution-focused point of view. And in my day-to-day work, I work a lot with childminders and packaway nurseries. And I think there is massive untapped potential in terms of access, having parents within local communities access that high quality childcare through home-based educators, childminders, packaway nurseries. These are the places that need to be properly funded to give these children that place to go, you know, to be able to access that quality. And just in regards to the second recommendation, in regards to local authority support services, working as an advisor, I've seen for myself children's centres closing down, and the impact that had in the local communities that were accessing them. I mean, it's so important to have those streamlined support services in easy reach for these families, and children's services were having all of that under one roof is a key part of that. There will always be a need for those streamlined support services, that early intervention. It will always be needed. So that reinvestment in children's centres is just paramount. You know, particularly when we look at the data and we see that huge disparity with the marginalised groups and, you know, the BAME groups, that those groups, children who are in families of young mothers, disabled children, it really is important. But yeah, finally, I'll just end on, in terms of just that impact and the, you know, the things that local authorities are able to do. Part of my current role, I'm working on a national early years program at the moment, where I'm a key contact to 30 local authorities across the country. And I work with these local authorities every day, and I'm hearing the stories of the ground of what nurseries are going through, what parents are going through. And local authorities are in a real key position to do so much of this needed work. So yeah, again, closing that gap, children's centres, local authorities, it's really, really important, but I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Annika. That was really instructive. I just wanted to flag to everyone that the Q&A function doesn't appear to be working. So if you could start putting your questions in the chat function instead, I'll make sure we come to them at the end after we've heard from Karen, who is our next respondent. So I will go over to Karen now. Karen is Professor Karen Wells, who's a professor in childhood studies at Birkbeck, and she spent 20 years researching the intersection between political economy and socio-cultural fields and how that impacts on the way that children grow up. So Karen, over to you.
Hey, thanks for the introduction. So I don't really work on childhood poverty in the UK. Most of my work is on childhood poverty in the global south. And I guess one of the striking things about reading the report and thinking about childhood poverty in the UK is that many of the same issues that are faced by countries with far fewer resources than the United Kingdom are being replicated here. The issues of reducing child poverty, of increasing children's well-being, of giving children a good start in life. All of these issues we can see in economies across the world. And so we have to kind of maybe ask a question about why the political will isn't there to address these issues, even when the money is. The United Kingdom, as people have been saying, is one of the world's largest economies, the 6th largest economy, has a GDP of $2.83 trillion, and yet it can't address childhood poverty in the under fives. So what I'm going to talk about is just a few reflections on what we need to do to really change this situation. Couple of observations to start with, which are maybe helpful. The national living wage in the UK is lower, it's higher by £1 than the national minimum wage. So in other words, the wage that the government says firms have to pay workers is £1, and the government also says is necessary for workers to live on. And in London, that rises to £2 gap. This in itself seems to me completely nonsensical. How can the government declare that there is a living wage which is £1 higher than the minimum wage it says employers have to pay? And I'll come back to what that's about in a moment. The second point I want to kind of just say introductory remarks about is intergenerational wealth. The impact of the fact, and I kind of thought about this when Annika was talking just now and talking about growing up in poverty and then herself being in a better situation than she or policymakers may have anticipated when she was a child. And I think what's really important here is also to acknowledge that while that's true of some working class people, and I would include myself in that, who grew up in relative poverty and then through a mixture of luck and other kind of circumstances changed our position, the lack of intergenerational wealth has a serious follow-on impact on childhood poverty, because when there is a financial crisis, when the price of food goes up, when the price of rent goes up, wealthier families who have intergenerational wealth can look to a wider social network to support them through those crises, and families without that intergenerational wealth quite simply cannot. There's been some work done on this in the United States, and the huge impact that the financial crisis had, and then that COVID had and loss of work had, particularly on African American families, because of the lack of intergenerational wealth, which runs into globally, I mean, across the whole economy, billions of pounds. And that's the same in the UK. So I feel like that's something that really needs to be addressed in this conversation about childhood poverty, because otherwise we go back to a kind of individual solution that individuals just need to do the right things and have the right personal strategies, and eventually their lives will change. I feel like we need a much more structural analysis than that, or in addition to that. On the question of the wrong postcode, so I grew up in Haringey in Tottenham, where there was and still is a gap of 7 years of life expectancy between the most and the least deprived areas. Literally, poverty kills people, literally. And I think that kind of urgency of what poverty really means. I mean, we've talked about the lived experience, and that's really important, but I think we also need to be much more visceral about it, and to demonstrate the impact literally on not just quality of life, but length of life. So we see in the report that child poverty is on the increase, that it's unequally distributed across the population. And I think, as I just mentioned there, even within one borough, it's unequally distributed. And I think it's also interesting to note that London, there is a second highest rate of childhood poverty at the under fives, given that typically when a policy issue comes up and London responds in a certain way, Brexit would be a case in point, it's said that, well, London's this privileged space, it's completely different to the rest of the country. It's absolutely not. There's deep poverty in London, and that deep poverty is hidden by this discourse of wealth in the southeast in the public policy discourse. Why is there so much poverty? Because work is low paid and childcare is expensive. That's essentially what the report's arguing. And single parents and Black and minority ethnic households, as we saw from the first presentation, are experiencing higher rates of under five poverty than other poor households. And again, it's important to think about that structurally, to think about the racism and the lack of intergenerational wealth, which itself is a consequence of racism. That means that Black and minority ethnic households are in worse off positions than white households of the same strata or class. The extent of in-work poverty is very striking, and we've heard now for decades about the importance of various initiatives to get people into work, to get people back to work. Under the Brown government, who's promised to end child poverty, there was this kind of moral panic about generations of workless households, and work is seen as the absolute target, the sine qua non of ending poverty. But as we've seen, it doesn't, because it will only end poverty as wages are sufficiently high enough to address that. And we've seen that it very much isn't high enough, and the government itself acknowledges that. Also, a minor point that I found very surprising in the report is that outright home ownership is still correlated with under 5 poverty in 20% of those who outright own their homes. Very striking point. I'm not quite sure what to do with it, but I think it might pay off some sort of drilling down. That said, housing costs is clearly one of the most significant contributors to poverty. And here again, I think we need an historical perspective. There used to be a fairly good social housing provision in England. It was absolutely decimated by the Thatcher government, as we all know, alongside the liberalisation of the rental sector. But that argument's never been won again. The argument for good quality social housing that's somehow tagged against people's actual wages, and the control of the rental sector so that it's also tagged against people's actual wages. This argument hasn't been won since the Thatcher government. And this is a point about arguments and public policy discourse I'm going to return to. In general, what we're seeing is the effects of what academics call the commodification of the cost of social reproduction, right? Social reproduction means what do you need to live? To pay for housing, to look after your children, to get food, to get water, to get heating. That's social reproduction. Everybody has to pay for it. Everybody has these costs, everybody, everywhere in the world. But in a society where those costs become the source of profits for some people, that is unsustainable for the majority of people. And that's what we're witnessing. Things that we literally need to live, housing, food, water, energy. We literally need these things to live, and they've all become commodified. They've all become a source of profits for someone. And that needs to change, because without changing that, we are not going to have a sustainable economy where children are not living in poverty. It's simply untenable for the things that we need to live to be commodified in the way that they've become really since the Thatcher period onwards, and that's never really changed since then. It's become, in fact, entrenched and deeper. I think the other point I'd want to make in general terms is the lack of voice of children and the lack of recognition of children's experience in public discourse. And as a childhood studies scholar, obviously that's something that I'm particularly interested and concerned about. We have families, we have parents, to some extent their voice comes into the public discourse, but children themselves, not so much. And the recognition of children's experiences is really a murmur in public discourse. And I think we really need to bring children into this conversation, to have them talk about their experiences, to have them describe what it's like to live in poverty and what they think the solution to living in poverty might be. Okay, so the recommendations made in the report are very reasonable and actually very modest. Quality childcare, better early years services, and an end to the benefit cap. But the report's excellent. The statistics are very informative, if utterly depressing. But we need to change public opinion in order, a sea change in public opinion, to really have any of these very modest, reasonable recommendations implemented. Because we've known this now for literally decades, if not 2 centuries. Childcare when children are young, and sufficient money to raise children is what we need to lift children out of poverty. And this goes back to the question of who pays for stuff, right? There has to be a change in how the public thinks about who should pay for the cost of raising children. Increasingly, the cost of raising children is seen as a private issue. You're a parent, you pay for your child. You want another child, make sure you can pay for them. That's become the discourse, the public discourse. And actually that is very different to the discourse probably even 50 years ago, where children were seen as more like a part of society, a social cost that we all have to bear, that we all should bear, that we all have an obligation to bear, whatever or not we are or aren't parents. And that I think that's what we've got to change, the public discourse about whose children are these children? Who should pay for raising them? Just their parents? Or the firms that employ parents? Or the government? Now, how you answer that question is depends on political ideology. Of course, as you probably guessed by now, my answer will be the government should pay, and they should raise the money to pay by taxing capital at sufficient rates to have the money to pay for all of these things that, well, these very modest things that we're asking for. But we currently have a government democratically elected, and therefore to some degree reflecting the opinions of, unfortunately, quite a large part of society that think the cost of raising children should primarily be borne by parents. That's what's got to change. We have to shift that public opinion, and we have to shift public discourse. Even during the Labour government, when Brown was arguing that they were going to end child poverty within a generation, that same discourse of it was the responsibility of parents to really do that and really address that was very much in play. Children still weren't really being talked about as a social good. I mean, it's not quite the right word, but I don't quite know how else to phrase it, but something that we all have to bear the costs of raising, of looking after. The discourse that it's up to parents is the reason for the cap on universal credit for 2 children. It's to literally financially penalise working class families and get them to think that they should not have more children unless they personally can meet the cost of raising those children. It's a relatively recent innovation, and it's a sign that the argument that raising children is a social good has been lost and needs to be won again.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Karen. We've now got about 15 minutes left for audience questions, and I can see some of them start to come in through the chat function. So thank you very much. The first question I'm going to pick you all, and it comes from, let me see, it's a bit complicated to have to scroll through the chat. I think it was from, oh yeah, it's from Jane Richards. And she asked a question about free universal childcare and draws a comparison with Norway, where childcare is free for all children over 1. And I guess I wanted to supplement that question with, it feels like some of these answers are quite big and structural actually to child poverty. So I wanted to bring in housing. And I think the fact that we've got such high housing costs in this country and really high poverty rates, particularly amongst families who live in the private rented sector. And, you know, we've got far fewer families living in social housing now than we did about 50 years ago, post Second World War. So it does feel like Jane's pointed out, like with social housing, that some of these solutions are actually they're not tinkering around the edges, they're big and structural. So I wanted to get the panel's response to that. Who would like to go first on that? Anyone? I mean, I think it relates to some of what you were saying, Karen, just then.
Sure. Can you just repeat it? Would you mind? I was looking at the chat and I kind of didn't quite register.
So the question is, how can we, I guess, bring about some of the big structural changes that we might need, like Jane Richards' suggestion of free universal childcare for children over the age of 1, or a much bigger programme of public investment in housing, in social housing?
Well, I mean, it's almost impossible to answer that, isn't it? Like, it's kind of what I'm saying. Like the shift away from public housing and away from the social costs of raising children has now been going on for several decades, really, from the kind of Thatcher government onwards. And even when there was a Labour government, it very much took that same approach, perhaps in a slightly more mitigated form, where the worst excesses of that will be mitigated against by some social security cap. But really what we need is we need a change in politics. We need political parties to feel that it would be a manifesto win to say that they're going to reinvest in social housing which is affordable and is provided by the public sector, not in these endless private-public partnerships, which actually ends up seeing more profit go to private providers. And we need to see it as a manifesto win that childcare is fully socialised, that, for example, shared parental leave for the first year for both parents is seen as the norm. How you do that is simply by the hard work of doing it, of kind of convincing others, of having events like this, of questioning MPs about their commitments, of organising. Really, I mean, there's no shortcut to political organising other than political organising. Yeah.
Great. Would anyone else from the panel like to come in on that, or shall I move to our next question? Carla, Carla.
I was just going to say,
and I've actually got another question for you, which I might address to you specifically as well, which hopefully you might. So we've had a question from Jonathan Levy about how rates of child poverty in the UK compare internationally. So as our data person on the panel, I wondered if you might be able to answer that as well. Over to you.
So I might not be able to give a very comprehensive answer to that. And actually, Karen, since you've got a focus across the rest of the world, you might have more to say on this. But one of the problems with comparing poverty is often we measure it in different ways. So the poverty that I've been talking about is based on the median income on a specific year within the UK. So we would have to compare it on median incomes in different countries. So it's a slightly different measure. But I did have a little look online at different comparisons using other measures, which I'll pop in the chat. So it's not the same, like the values won't match up to the values that I have presented because it's measuring poverty in a slightly different way, but it means that you can compare better across countries. So I'll pop that in the chat for you. In general, we don't do that great, bearing in mind what everyone has said, that we are a relatively wealthy country. And I also was going to say that there has been, in terms of the childcare question, so I'm an analyst for Scotland at the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, and there has been some progress in Scotland to try and increase the number of hours that are accessible for free early years care, although there's still lots of things still needing done to make sure that people get enough childcare and the right childcare. But it might be worth having a look at the Scottish Government's sort of plans around that and what they're thinking about doing, if you want to sort of see something happening in real life.
Great, thank you. Emily, the next question is for you, and it comes from Sophie Livingston, who's the Chief Exec of Little Village. And she found your contribution very moving, and she wondered specifically what response you have at your baby bank to families receiving second-hand pre-loved items, because at Little Village, she says there's sometimes some resistance, which does change when people see the quality of items that come in. But she says she'd be very interested in doing some research on how we could destigmatize second-hand items so it becomes kind of more acceptable to reuse things, and kind of just wondered whether you had any insights on that.
Yeah, we find a big range. So ethnicity for us plays a big part in whether people are prepared to look into secondhand or not. We have some cultures where secondhand is a big no-no, and we really have to sell it to these people, usually by packaging it up carefully, maybe throwing in some that we are lucky enough to still have tags on. But it is a shame, because a lot of these items, if you've ever had a small child, you know, particularly the smaller, are practically brand new because they only wore them once or twice anyway. But I do think there is a big cultural shift that needs more looking into, and how we can encourage families to think it's not secondhand because nobody loved it. It's secondhand and it was donated on from this family to help your family. And it is, for me, like, I love Little Village's name, because for me it is all about it takes a village. And I would never dream of passing on anything I wouldn't put on my own children. And that's what I tell these families. And I invite them to come and be part of our village. And sometimes I might even know the story of where the items came from, and I can pass it on. And that all things like that do help with the encouraging families to just take a chance on these items and love them as much as I do when I'm handing them out.
Great, thank you. We've also had a question about children's voice and what we can do to improve children's voice in this debate and the representation of children and children's experiences. Would anyone from the panel like to take that? Yeah, Emily?
Sorry, can I just say?
Come to you, Annika, if that's all right.
We have tried this at the baby bank because we don't just do 0 to 5s. We started as 0 to 3. The pandemic hit, older children's services closed, and we filled it as far as we can. So we do sort of 0 to about 14, 15 now, where we're able to. and we have tried. And a lot of these children tell us such heartbreaking things that Karen is absolutely right. We must be capturing this data better. We must be giving these children a voice, be it, I just want a pair of shoes that fit so I can play football with my friend. You gave me a football, or social services gave me a football, but I can't run in these shoes. And it is things like that. And I think if people could hear the children's voices, maybe it would go further into understanding that these are not just my child, it's not just my responsibility. We have a responsibility to all of the little people around us to love them and to cherish them and to support them the best that we can. And over to you, Annika.
I hope you can hear me, because I'm getting a sign that my internet connection isn't stable. But just quickly to say, thank you, Professor Karen, for bringing up the children's voice. It's such an important thing. And as powerful as the parent voice in the report was, it just brought me, when you said that, it brought me right back to my time working as a teacher in schools, you know, where children would come in and share stories about, you know, their jumper smelling of damp, and just things that they would notice from their perspective, or how embarrassed they were with the clothes that didn't fit and things like that. And yeah, I think it is so important to capture this so that we can, as we did in the report, kind of see the reality of these problems and what it actually looks like, for these children. So yeah, I'll leave it there. That's all I wanted to kind of add, how important it is.
A very quick one on voice of the child with children who are between 0 and 5. So a common saying in early years and also in speech and language therapy is that behaviour is communication as well. So even among children who cannot speak yet, who do not yet have the verbal and cognitive faculties, because they're such tiny children, you can see it in them suddenly having a place to play and toys, and then having a burst in development because they have a high chair now and they're able to access different food groups, and they suddenly have books now and they're able to have a burst in their vocabulary, for example. So although we cannot yet access the language of children who are between 0 and 5 years old, we are still at the liberty of speaking to their families, but we are able to see the experience of those children through non-verbal cues and through accounts of their experiences, and also what we witness in baby banks at that age group. So it takes more effort, but we can try and capture the experiences of these children, even if we cannot capture it in their words just yet, maybe with the 4 to 5 year olds.
That's really helpful. Thanks, Sophia. Karen, did you want to come in?
Yeah, just quickly to say, childhood studies, which is it's a field of academic study. It has many methods for doing research, even with very young children. So if people are interested in thinking about how to get the voice of the child, just Google childhood studies plus research methods, and you'll get a load of different strategies for bringing the voice of the child into your research.
Great, thank you so much. Now I had another question, I think from, I'm just scrolling back up. Yes, from another question from Jonathan Levy, which is, what role do you think there is for the private sector to play in reducing child poverty through the provision of employee benefits such as on-site or subsidised childcare? Would anyone like to take that one? Annika? No? Okay. I mean, I guess the thing with this is, oh, Carla, we'll go over to you.
Just from the perspective of JRF, I mean, we think it's really important that employers think about child poverty generally. So there's lots that employers can do to help support families that could be living in poverty. And Karen talked a lot about this, adequate and suitable pay for work is obviously critical. There's also lots of other things that they can do, like providing contracts with enough hours that people want, helping with progression, supporting parents, particularly as you saw in the report, single parents have so many barriers to accessing work, even when they want to work. You might not want to work when your child's a toddler, but once you want to get into work, like employers have lots that they can do to support these families. So obviously that is not something to do with childcare, but I think that the actual fundamental thing, the structural changes need to be in these, how do we increase people's incomes? And that's when employers really need to step up and play their part.
Great. Karen and Sophia, I think I can see you've both got your hands up on that question, and then we might have to bring the event to a close because we're getting close to 1:15. So Sophia, I'll come to you first and then to Karen.
I'll keep it very brief. So in terms of interim methods and more generally, employers can enact flexible working, and a huge element of women being exited from the workforce when they have young children is maternity discrimination, as well as lack of flexible working and just consideration of caring responsibilities and how this impacts on our time. Having a child is a huge motivator, and it comes with a huge set of skills such as patience and creativity and new ways of working. So it is important that employers are retaining talent in the workforce by increasing income and through flexible working and just inclusion. And also in terms of events, networking, socializing, and the things that surround our working lives that have a huge role in our progression. Also conferences, have a creche, reimburse childcare expenses. And this will not necessarily be open to all fields, but wherever possible, employers should be facilitating and trying to offset the costs and the difficulties with accessing childcare. Handing over to Karen.
Okay, two very quick points. One, pay their tax, stop with all the tax evasion. That would help. Two, I think work also gets a little bit fetishized. Like, it's also fine to not want to be in work, but to still have a comfortable life and well-being and to look after your children at home. That's also okay. But at the moment, it's financially impossible for anybody but the wealthiest families. So that's part of what I mean by socialized childcare, that actually maybe some people would like to actually be paid to look after their own children rather than pay another low-paid worker to look after their child when they go to a low-paid job that they're not particularly enjoying. So it's also about kind of thinking in other ways about not just the work-life balance, but that the purpose of our life is not to just work and make profits for other people. So I'll stop there.
Great, thank you so much, Karen. I think I am going to have to draw things to an end now, but I wanted to say a huge thank you, first of all, to our panel for their contribution today. Big thanks to Little Village and to the JOF, particularly Carla and Sophia, for all their hard work on this report. I do think it's a very important report. I mean, I still find it quite hard to get my head around the fact, really, that in the Northeast, 47% of families with an under 5 live in poverty. I mean, that just cannot be right. It's really, really dreadful, and it leads to the sorts of circumstances that we heard Emily talk about. So I do think this is a really urgent issue. It is a political challenge, though, for us all, I think, and it can feel very frustrating with this government in particular, that they do seem to be taking policy choices with very little thought, well, who knows what it is, but with little regard to the implications for levels of child poverty and the realities that families on a low income face. So thank you to everyone who presented and who responded. Also, a huge thank you to our audience for coming along, for being so lively in the chat. I can see some really good policy discussions that have been happening in the chat, as well as questions, actually. So that is great. And hopefully we will see you all again soon to pick up this discussion sometime soon. So thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your Tuesday.